This is from Breitbart, I believe it is. Single here. Breitbart. And this is the vote on impeachment.
Leader is recognized.
Mr. Chief Justice, the Senate is now ready to vote on the articles of impeachment, and after that is done, we will adjourn the court of impeachment.
The clerk will now read the first article of impeachment.
So there we are. The clerk's going to read it, and this is Mitch McConnell introducing it. This is Judge Roberts, Supreme Court Chief Justice.
Impeachment.
Article 1, Abuse of Power. The Constitution provides that the House of Representatives, quote, shall have the sole power of impeachment, unquote, and that the President, quote, shall be removed from office on impeachment for and conviction of treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors, close quote. In his conduct of the office of President of the United States, and in violation of his constitutional oath faithfully to execute the office of President of the United States. And
there's the House individuals, leaders. They're not going to like this.
And to the best of his ability, preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States, and in violation of his constitutional duty to take care that the laws be faithfully executed, Donald J. Trump has abused the powers of the presidency in that, using the powers of his office, President Trump solicited the interference of a foreign government, Ukraine, in the 2020 United States presidential election. He did so through a scheme or course of conduct that included soliciting the government of Ukraine to publicly announce investigations that would benefit his re-election, harm the election prospects of a political opponent, and influence the 2020 United States presidential election to his advantage. President Trump also sought to pressure the government of Ukraine to...
So this is what they're saying he did. The House is saying that he did these things, and this is why he should be impeached.
Take these steps by conditioning official United States government acts of significant value to Ukraine on its public announcement of the investigations. President Trump engaged in this scheme or course of conduct for corrupt purposes in pursuit of personal political benefit. In doing so, President Trump used the powers of the presidency in a manner that compromised the national security of the United States and undermined the integrity of the United States democratic process. He thus ignored and injured the interests of the nation. President Trump engaged in this scheme or course of conduct through the following means. 1. President Trump, acting both directly and through his agents within and outside the United States government, corruptly solicited the government of Ukraine to publicly announce investigations into A, political opponent, former Vice President Joseph R. Biden Jr., and B, a discredited theory promoted by Russia alleging that Ukraine, rather than Russia, interfered in the 2016 United States presidential election. 2, with the same corrupt motives, President Trump, acting both directly and through his agents within the outside of the United States government, conditioned 2 official acts on the public announcements that he had requested. A, the release of $391 million of United States taxpayer funds that Congress had appropriated on a bipartisan basis for the purpose of providing vital military and security assistance to Ukraine to oppose Russian aggression, and which President Trump had ordered suspended. And B, a head of state meeting at the White House, which the President of Ukraine sought to demonstrate continued United States support for the government of Ukraine in the face of Russian aggression. 3, faced with the public revelation of his actions, President Trump ultimately released the military and security assistance to the government of Ukraine and has persisted in openly and corruptly urging and soliciting Ukraine to undertake investigations for his personal political benefit. These actions were consistent with President Trump's previous invitations of foreign interference in United States elections. In all of this, President Trump abused the powers of the presidency by ignoring and injuring national security and other vital national interests to obtain an improper personal political benefit. He has also betrayed the nation by abusing his high office to enlist a foreign power in corrupting democratic elections. Wherefore, President Trump, by such conduct, has demonstrated that he will remain a threat to national security and the Constitution if allowed to remain in office, and has acted in a manner grossly incompatible with self-governance and the rule of law. President Trump thus warrants impeachment and trial, removal from office, and disqualification to hold and enjoy any office of honor, trust, or profit under the United States.
Wow.
Each senator, when his or her name is called, will stand in his or her place and vote guilty or not guilty as required by Rule 23 of the Senate Rules on Impeachment. Article 1, Section 3, Clause 6 of the Constitution regarding the vote required for conviction on impeachment provides that no person shall be convicted without the concurrence of 2/3 of the members present. The question is on the first article of impeachment. Senators, how say you? Is the respondent, Donald John Trump, guilty or not guilty? A roll call vote is required. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander. Not guilty. Mr. Alexander, not guilty. Ms. Baldwin. Guilty. Ms. Baldwin, guilty. Mr. Barrasso. Not guilty. Mr. Barrasso, not guilty. Mr. Bennett. Guilty. Mr. Bennett, guilty. Mrs. Blackburn. Not guilty. Mrs. Blackburn, not guilty. Mr. Blumenthal. Guilty. Mr. Blumenthal, guilty. Mr. Blunt. Not guilty. Mr. Blunt, not guilty. Mr. Booker. Guilty. Mr. Booker, guilty. Mr. Bozeman. Not guilty. Mr. Bozeman, not guilty. Mr. Braun. Not guilty. Mr. Braun, not guilty. Mr. Brown. Guilty. Mr. Brown, guilty. Mr. Burr. Not guilty. Mr. Burr, not guilty. Ms. Cantwell. Guilty. Ms. Cantwell, guilty. Mrs. Capito. Mrs. Capito, not guilty. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Cardin, guilty. Mr. Carper. Mr. Carper, guilty. Mr. Casey. Mr. Casey, guilty. Mr. Cassidy. Mr. Cassidy, not guilty. Ms. Collins. Ms. Collins, not guilty. Mr. Coons. Mr. Coons,
Now, notice that Collins indicated that she would do not guilty, and she did not guilty.
guilty. Mr. Cornyn. Mr. Cornyn, not guilty. Ms. Cortez Masto. Ms. Cortez Masto, guilty. Mr. Cotton. Not guilty. Mr. Cotton, not guilty. Mr. Kramer. Mr. Kramer, not guilty. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Crapo, not guilty. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Cruz, not guilty. Mr. Daines. Mr. Daines, not guilty.
Ms. Montana Senator Daines, not guilty. I expected that.
Ms. Duckworth. Ms. Duckworth, guilty. Mr. Durbin. Mr. Durbin, guilty. Mr. Enzi. Mr. Enzi, not guilty. Ms. Ernst. Ms. Ernst, not guilty. Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Feinstein, guilty. Mrs. Fisher.
No surprise there.
Mrs. Fisher, not guilty. Mr. Gardner. Mr. Gardner, not guilty. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mrs. Gillibrand, guilty. Mr. Graham. Mr. Graham, not guilty. Mr. Grassley. Mr. Grassley, not guilty. Ms. Harris.
No surprise there.
Ms. Harris, guilty. Ms. Hassan. Ms. Hassan, guilty. Mr. Hawley. Mr. Hawley, not guilty. Mr. Heinrich. Mr. Heinrich, guilty. Ms. Hirono. Ms. Hirono, guilty. Mr. Hoven. Mr. Hoven, not guilty. Mrs. Hyde-Smith.
Not guilty.
Mrs. Hyde-Smith, not guilty. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Inhofe, not guilty. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Johnson, not guilty. Mr. Jones. Mr. Jones, guilty. Mr. Kane. Mr. Kane, guilty. Mr. Kennedy. Mr. Kennedy, not guilty. Mr. King. Mr. King, guilty. Ms. Klobuchar. Ms. Klobuchar, guilty. Mr. Langford. Mr. Langford, not guilty. Mr. Leahy. Mr. Leahy, guilty. Mr. Lee. Mr. Lee, not guilty. Mrs. Leffler. Mrs. Leffler, not guilty. Mr. Manchin. Mr. Manchin, guilty. Mr. Markey. Mr. Markey, guilty. Mr. McConnell. Mr. McConnell, not guilty. Ms. McSally. Ms. McSally, not guilty. Mr. Menendez. Mr. Menendez, guilty. Mr. Merkley. Mr. Merkley, guilty. Mr. Moran. Mr. Moran, not guilty. Ms. Murkowski. Ms. Murkowski, not guilty. Mr. Murphy. Mr. Murphy, guilty. Mrs. Murray. Mrs. Murray, guilty. Mr. Paul. Mr. Paul, not guilty. Mr. Perdue. Mr. Perdue, not guilty. Mr. Peters. Mr. Peters, guilty. Mr. Portman. Mr. Portman, not guilty. Mr. Reed. Mr. Reed, guilty. Mr. Risch. Mr. Risch, not guilty. Mr. Roberts. Mr. Roberts, not guilty. Mr. Romney. Mr. Romney, guilty.
There's Romney. He said he would vote guilty, and he did. He needs to be ousted. Shame on him.
Ms. Rosen. Ms. Rosen, guilty. Mr. Rounds. Mr. Rounds, not guilty. Mr. Rubio. Mr. Rubio, not guilty. Mr. Sanders. Mr. Sanders, guilty. Mr. Sass. Mr. Sass, not guilty. Mr. Schatz. Mr. Schatz, guilty. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Schumer, guilty. Mr. Scott of Florida. Mr. Scott of Florida,
So they have two Scots.
not guilty. Mr. Scott of South Carolina. Mr. Scott of South Carolina, not guilty. Mrs. Shaheen. Mrs. Shaheen, guilty. Mr. Shelby. Mr. Shelby, not guilty. Ms. Sinema. Ms. Sinema, guilty. Ms. Smith. Ms. Smith, guilty. Ms. Stabenow. Ms. Stabenow, guilty. Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Sullivan, not guilty. Mr. Tester. Mr. Tester, guilty. Mr. Thune.
Mr. Tester, you suck, and you wouldn't cheated on your voting in Montana, you wouldn't be in there.
Thune. Mr. Thune, not guilty. Mr. Tillis. Mr. Tillis, not guilty. Mr. Toomey. Mr. Toomey, not guilty. Mr. Udall. Mr. Udall, guilty. Mr. Van Hollen. Mr. Van Hollen, guilty. Mr. Warner. Mr. Warner, guilty. Ms. Warren. Ms. Warren, guilty. Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Whitehouse, guilty. Mr. Wicker. Mr. Wicker, not guilty. Mr. Wyden. Mr. Wyden, guilty. Mr. Young. Mr. Young, not guilty.
That should be it. So what's the vote? Romney is a fool. Sorry, but he's a fool. Handing it to the Supreme Court, Judge Roberts.
In this article of impeachment, 48 senators have pronounced Donald John Trump, President of the United States, guilty as charged.
48.
52 senators have pronounced
52.
him not guilty as charged.
Wow.
Two-thirds of the senators present not having pronounced him guilty, the Senate adjudges that the respondent, Donald John Trump, President of the United States, is not guilty as charged in the first article of impeachment.
It would take 2/3. You can clearly see this is mostly bipartisan. It's most unfortunate. No way close to 2/3.
The clerk will read the second article of impeachment.
Another clerk.
Article 2, obstruction of Congress. The Constitution provides that the House of Representatives shall have the sole power of impeachment and that the President shall be removed from office on impeachment.
I'm going to stop here and take for a moment. So 48 to 52, 48 said he was guilty, 52 said they weren't. Collins went on one side, Romney went on the other, but there was another that went on the side of the president, on the Democratic side, I believe. We'll find out more about that individual in a moment.
4 and conviction of treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. In his conduct of the office of the President of the United States and in violation of his constitutional oath faithfully to execute the office of President of the United States and, to the best of his ability, preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States, and in violation of his constitutional duty to take care that the laws be faithfully executed.
Those must be pages walking in.
Donald J. Trump has directed the unprecedented, categorical, and indiscriminate defiance of subpoenas issued by the House of Representatives pursuant to its sole power of impeachment. President Trump has abused the powers of the presidency in a manner offensive to and subversive of the Constitution in that the House of Representatives has engaged in an impeachment inquiry focused on President Trump's corrupt solicitation of the government of Ukraine to interfere in the 2020 United States presidential election. As part of this impeachment inquiry, the committee's undertaking the investigation serves subpoenas seeking documents and testimony deemed vital to the inquiry from various executive branch agencies.
The subpoenas were very limited. They are partisan, and they didn't even get to the 18th whistleblower. They denied their record there even after he was subpoenaed, and they recorded the witnesses. They wouldn't even let the material out. Insane.
Agencies and offices and current and former officials. In response, without lawful cause or excuse, President Trump directed executive branch agencies, offices, and officials not to comply with those subpoenas. President Trump thus interposed the powers of the presidency against the lawful subpoenas of the House of Representatives and assumed to himself functions and judgments necessary to the exercise of the sole power of impeachment vested by the Constitution in the House of Representatives. President Trump abused the powers of his high office through the following means. 1, directing the White House to defy a lawful subpoena by withholding the production of documents sought therein by the committees. 2, directing other executive branch agencies and offices to defy lawful subpoenas and withhold the production of documents and records from the committees, in response to which the Department of State, Office of Management and Budget, Department of Energy, and Department of Defense refused to produce a single document or record. 3, directing current and former executive branch officials not to
Single document record. I would have to listen to this again.
cooperate with the committees, in response to which 9 administration officials defied subpoenas for testimony, namely John Michael Mick Mulvaney, Robert B. Blair, John A. Eisenberg, Michael Ellis, Kristen Wells Griffith, Russell T. Vaught, Michael Duffy, Brian McCormick, and T. Ulrich Breckbull. These actions were consistent with President Trump's previous efforts to undermine United States government investigations into foreign interference in United States elections. Through these actions, President Trump sought to arrogate to himself the right to determine the propriety, scope, and nature of an impeachment inquiry into his own conduct, as well as the unilateral prerogative to deny any and all information to the House of Representatives in the exercise of its sole power of impeachment. In the history of the Republic, no president has ever ordered the complete defiance of an impeachment inquiry or sought to obstruct and impede so comprehensively the ability of the House of Representatives to investigate high crimes and misdemeanors. This abuse of office served to cover up the president's own repeated misconduct and to seize and control the power of impeachment, and thus to nullify a vital constitutional safeguard vested solely in the House of Representatives. In all of this, President Trump has acted in a manner contrary to his trust as president and subversive of the constitutional government, to the great prejudice of the cause of law and justice, and to the manifest injury of the people of the United States. Wherefore, President Trump, by such conduct, has demonstrated that he will remain a threat to the Constitution if allowed to remain in office, and has acted in a manner grossly incompatible with self-governance and the rule of law. President Trump thus warrants impeachment and trial, removal from office, and disqualification to hold and enjoy any office of honor, trust, or profit under the United States.
The question is on the second article of impeachment. Senators, how say you? Is the respondent, Donald John Trump, guilty or not guilty? The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander. Not guilty. Not guilty. Ms. Baldwin. Guilty. Mr. Barrasso. Not guilty. Mr. Bennett. Guilty. Mrs. Blackburn. Not guilty. Mr. Blumenthal. Guilty. Mr. Blunt. Not guilty. Mr. Booker. Guilty. Mr. Bozeman. Not guilty. Mr. Braun. Not guilty. Mr. Brown. Guilty. Mr. Burr. Not guilty. Ms. Cantwell. Guilty. Mrs. Capito. Not guilty. Mr. Cardin. Guilty. Mr. Carper. Guilty. Mr. Casey. Guilty. Mr. Cassidy. Not guilty. Ms. Collins. Not guilty. Mr. Coons.
So this is following just about what the first vote did, verbatim, I believe. Collins again switched sides and said not guilty. Good for her.
Guilty. Mr. Cornyn. Not guilty. Ms. Cortez Masto. Guilty. Mr. Cotton. Not guilty. Mr. Kramer. Not guilty. Mr. Crapo.
Hello?
Not guilty. Mr. Cruz. Not guilty. Mr. Daines. Not guilty. Ms. Duckworth. Guilty. Mr. Durbin? Guilty. Mr. Enzi? Not guilty. Ms. Ernst? Not guilty. Mrs. Feinstein? Guilty. Mrs. Fisher? Not guilty. Mr. Gardner? Not guilty. Mrs. Gillibrand? Guilty. Mr. Graham? Not guilty. Mr. Grassley? Not guilty. Ms. Harris? Guilty. Ms. Hassan? Guilty. Mr. Hawley? Not guilty. Mr. Heinrich? Guilty. Ms. Hirono? Guilty. Mr. Hoven? Not guilty. Mrs. Hyde-Smith? Not guilty. Mr. Inhofe? Not guilty. Mr. Johnson? Not guilty. Mr. Jones?
Pages.
Guilty. Mr. Kane? Guilty. Mr. Kennedy? Not guilty. Mr. King? Guilty. Ms. Klobuchar? Guilty. Mr. Langford? Not guilty. Mr. Leahy? Guilty. Mr. Lee? Not guilty. Mrs. Leffler?
At least Mr. Lee, if he's the Lee of the Utah, has a brain in his head. Romney doesn't.
Not guilty. Mr. Manchin? Guilty. Mr. Markey? Guilty. Mr. McConnell? Not guilty. Ms. McSally? Not guilty. Mr. Menendez? Guilty. Mr. Merkley? Guilty. Mr. Moran? Not guilty. Ms. Murkowski? Not guilty. Mr. Murphy? Guilty. Mrs. Murray? Guilty. Mr. Paul? Not guilty. Mr. Perdue? Not guilty. Mr. Peters? Guilty. Mr. Portman? Not guilty. Mr. Reed? Guilty. Mr. Risch? Not guilty. Mr. Roberts? Not guilty. Mr. Romney? Not guilty. Ms. Rosen?
Ha! Romney did a not
Guilty.
guilty now? Holy Hannah.
Mr. Rounds? Not guilty. Mr. Rubio? Not guilty. Mr. Sanders? Guilty. Mr. Sass? Not guilty. Mr. Schatz? Guilty. Mr. Schumer? Guilty. Mr. Scott of Florida? Not guilty. Mr. Scott of South Carolina? Not guilty. Mrs. Shaheen? Guilty. Mr. Shelby? Not guilty. Ms. Sinema? Guilty. Ms. Smith? Guilty. Ms. Stabenow? Guilty. Mr. Sullivan? Not guilty. Mr. Tester? Guilty. Mr. Thune? Not guilty. Mr. Tillis? Not guilty. Mr. Toomey? Not guilty. Mr. Udall? Guilty. Mr. Van Hollen? Guilty. Mr. Warner? Guilty. Ms. Warren? Guilty. Mr. Whitehouse? Guilty. Mr. Wicker? Not guilty. Mr. Wyden? Guilty. Mr. Young? Not guilty.
Okay, so we go to the Roberts, Judge Roberts. Now tally them up. There it goes.
On this article of impeachment, 47 senators have pronounced Donald John Trump, President of the United States, guilty as charged.
The reason it's 47 is because Romney voted not guilty this time and guilty on the first one. What a ding-dong.
53 senators have pronounced him not guilty as charged. 2/3 of the senators present not having pronounced him guilty, the Senate adjudges that respondent Donald John Trump, President of the United States, is not guilty as charged in the second article of impeachment. The presiding officer directs Judge
47 to 53. Romney switched. That's the only reason it's different. All right, he voted guilty the first time, not guilty the second time. That's the only difference. It's a strange duffer. Anyhow, we're going to end this here. So here we are after the voting.
Then the second impulse was, let's get this over with as quickly as possible. Get it out of here, get it over in the other body, and let them deal with it. So that's why you had an abbreviated, truncated rush job over in the House. But even during that abbreviated period, it was pretty clear that they amassed a significant body of evidence from witnesses, which you heard them argue about over here frequently. They provided with us in the House record testimony from 13 witnesses, depositions from 17 witnesses. Then, of course, we added on top of that 180 questions. That we witnessed 193 witness video clips and 28,000 pages of evidence.
28,000 pages. Kidding me. What a waste.
So I asked my staff to count up the number of times we heard from the House managers during their presentation, how many times it was already proven. There were 60 times, 60, in which House managers said during their presentation to us that the case was either proven or proved. 60 times. There were 33 more times when one or more of the House managers said the evidence was overwhelming. So where did the nonsense about witnesses come from? I have a pretty good idea. After this thoroughly political exercise left the House and came over to the Senate, there was a lot of poll data taken. How are we going to sell this to senators? How are we going to sell it to the American people? Even though we already have all of this testimony and all of these witnesses, what polls well? Why, of course, if you ask the average citizen whether they think there ought to be witnesses in a trial, well, you're going to get an answer that you want. So the Speaker, I gather, decided...
Yeah, we want witnesses in the trial. What good's a trial without witnesses? What polls well? Political foolishness. Not justice or injustice. Politics. Polling. Power.
Decided to sit on the impeachment papers after arguing that this is a matter of great urgency and the president needed to be removed from office as soon as possible. Sit on them for a month to laughably think that that somehow gave me leverage to concede their principal political argument, which was this was all about witnesses over here on our side. Well, that brought one of those rare smiles to my face, which you witnessed, in which I was perplexed by the strategy that was being employed. Finally, when it became obvious to everyone it was an absurd position Democratic senators were saying, why don't you send the papers over? Some of our own members were saying it before they got slapped back into line. The papers came over, and we knew full well this was all going to be about witnesses. I had said to my colleagues back in December, in anticipation of the impeachment, that their strategy would be to get it out of the House quickly and to leave it in the Senate endlessly. Endlessly.
Leave it in the Senate endlessly, quote unquote. He wasn't going to have it.
So that we'd have that wrapped around our axle indefinitely. And my suspicion was that it wasn't so much about President Trump, but rather about taking the Senate.
Wasn't so much about Trump as taking the Senate. Interesting. They knew how close this was. Who could they rattle and get to if they prolonged this? What a shame.
And my counterpart, Senator Schumer, finally in the last few weeks pretty much admitted it to all of you that that's what this was all about. It was about taking the Senate and about trying to bog us down in this and to try to get my guys to have a lot of tough votes. So I'm proud of my colleagues for seeing through that, for knowing that even though if you ask a typical voter, should there be witnesses in a trial, they'd say, sure, of course there ought to be witnesses. That it was really about, not the president, we all knew he was not going to be removed from office, but about trying to take the Senate. And so I'm proud of my...
But about trying to take the Senate. We're going to end it here. All I know is that it is most unfortunate for the abuse of power. Most unfortunate. This guy just, I want to just punch him. I'm not going to listen to him. He's not worth the air that comes out of his mouth. Pure politics and crap, not the country. We're going to end this. Move on. I don't see that this is going to go forward much. I don't think that politics is getting out of the picture. I just think it's becoming more and more deeply entrenched and more divisive, unfortunately.